The hit era of Thomas has a mixed reception among fans. Some people like or tolerate it, and others hate or despise it. I'm personally with those people who tolerate it, and this year I'm going to talk about each season of this era and rank every episode in each season, starting off with the one that started it off, Season 8. It's been nearly 20 years since this season first came out, and to most, Season 8 is the most tolerable of the hit seasons. But for me, it isn't actually my favorite. Is it as good as the classic seasons? Let's find out. Unfortunately, Thomas and the Tuba was a poor start to the season and the hit era in general. This episode is really boring and has several plot points that don't make any sense. All these can be found in Usual Blokes video on Season 8. This episode immediately goes into the bad tier. Percy's new whistle isn't any better. The title is extremely misleading and Percy overall is extremely stupid. He really has a poor reputation in this series. I'm debating if I should put this above or below Thomas and the Tuba, but right now it goes below. Thomas to the Rescue is a huge improvement. Thomas and Diesel are actually tolerable, and it's overall so much better than the Steam Team to the Rescue. Not much more to say, so it goes into the favorites tier. Henry and the Wishing Tree is the first episode in this era that I completely disagree with the Thomas Cynic on. It is nice that they remembered Henry's love for nature, but what I can't stand is how stupid Henry is here. How is he horrible at pulling passenger trains? He has pulled them dozens of times in the show up to this point. Heck, he's even seen pulling them literally 2 episodes ago. He then wishes that he wouldn't have to pull passengers again at the end of the episode, and then he's seen pulling them again 10 episodes later, thus making this episode completely pointless. Not that it had a purpose to begin with. This episode goes into the bottom of the bad tier. James Gets a New Coat isn't much better. I think this episode highlights a huge problem I have with not just this era, but also the Miller era, the Blubber era, and even the Brenner era. And that is how the driver and fireman are non-existent. James's driver would not have allowed James to go by the canal, and he would have made him go straight to the coaling plant. James and Thomas are in character though, so this episode goes in the poor tier. I quite enjoy watching Thomas Saves the Day, mainly because of Thomas's dynamic with Annie and Clarabelle. I don't have much to say about it because a certain YouTuber said it all in his 10 hidden gems of this era. This episode goes in the great tier. Percy's big mistake is better than I remember. Percy's fear in this episode is actually justified. I would probably be scared too if I thought I was going to be executed the next day. And there is some nice model work here or there. It's not one of the season's greats, but it's decent and one of Percy's better episodes in this era. I used to hate Thomas, Emily, and the Snowplow. That was until recently. The reason was because of how much of a Emily was to Thomas, but after thinking about it, I decided that she can work in this type of story. Maybe if she was bossing Thomas around because deep down she cares for Thomas's safety and wants him to be on track and on time. It seems that's what they were trying to do, but they didn't execute it too well. Either way, this episode is alright and goes below Percy's big mistake in the okay tier. Don't Tell Thomas is a mid-episode. I think the concept was pretty nice, but the story is quite boring and the engines suck at keeping secrets. It goes between Percy's big mistake and Thomas, Emily, and the Snowplow in the okay tier. Emily's New Route is a really good episode. I do like Emily's portrayal in the hit era, but it was nice to see her have an episode where she isn't bossy once. Thus, it has some nice model work. My only gripe with this episode is Sir Topham Hatt. I feel he was way too harsh on Emily, but other than that, this episode is great and one of my favorites from this season. Thomas and the firework display is honestly just as good. This episode introduces the Thomas and James dynamic, which would become a mainstay in this era. And I gotta say, both engines are at their best when they're paired up. Plus, this episode's score absolutely slaps. My only gripe with this episode is the title. Since this is a Thomas and James story, shouldn't it be called Thomas, James, and the Firework Display instead of just Thomas and the Firework Display? Despite that, this episode goes at the top of the favorites tier so far. Gordon Takes Charge is another fantastic episode. Gordon and Percy's dynamic is really fun, and the story feels like a classic Gordon story. Although I have to question how Percy could forget how to pull passengers despite the fact that he is seen pulling them in Harold and the Flying Horse literally 19 episodes ago. It isn't as bad as Henry and the Wishing Tree because it at least doesn't imply that Percy has never pulled passengers before. Instead, it says that he hadn't pulled them for a long time. Other than that, this episode is one of my favorites. Spick and Span is nothing special. Henry should have replaced Emily, and the inspector giving contest for the cleanest engine is pretty dumb. This episode goes into the okay tier. Edward the Great is the best episode of the season. This episode is basically a retelling of The Tortoise and the Hare, and Edward and Spencer are the perfect characters for this kind of story. Edward also somewhat feels pretty close to his classic era personality. They could have easily had a moment at any point in this episode where Edward gives up and needs encouragement from another engine. But nope, he just keeps going despite how far Spencer is, and I like how Gordon encouraged him to keep going as well. I tell you, if Edward had lost the race to Spencer, I think he wouldn't care a bit. This episode is overall fantastic, and one of Edward's better episodes this era. Squeak, Rattle, and Roll is another amazing episode. Gordon's characterization here is handled perfectly, and is a nice callback to the Railway series story Tenders for Henry. The tone in this episode makes Tender Engines look like a Blubba episode, and is thus one of my favorites from this season. Thomas and the Circus, on the other hand, is one of my least favorite episodes from this season. This episode is a chore to sit through, and the moral about sharing is one that's been taught billions of times both before and after this episode. This is one of the morals that Thomas learns and forgets, and goes below Thomas and the Tuba in bad. Thomas Gets It Right isn't as bad, but it also contains an overused moral. In my video on Which Way Now, I used this episode as an example on how not to use the moral about rushing, and I still stand by what I said in that video. This episode is a drag and thus goes in the average tier. As Good as Gordon is a pretty good Emily episode. The idea of her pulling the express is a great one, and I think her characterization works well here. I mean, anyone is going to get all puffed up in the smoke box when given the job of pulling the express, am I right? I definitely prefer the Classic Creations version of this episode, but this version is far from being bad. Fish is another average episode. Seeing the fish being transported in open trucks instead of vans is so dumb, and seeing Thomas learn his lesson is getting old by now. But the crash was good though, which saves it from being bad. As opposed to Percy's big mistake, Emily's adventure is worse than I remember. I actually enjoyed this episode as a kid, but now I really dislike it. The moral is good, but Emily, man, what a bitch! This episode is just Emily bossing others around for no reason, and never apologizing properly. And the episode's title is so frickin' misleading. I can tolerate Thomas, Emily, and the Snowplow and As Good as Gordon, but not this. This episode goes below Henry and the Wishing Tree in the bad tier, but barely. Halloween is a really fun episode. Unlike most episodes this season, this one isn't trying to teach a moral. It instead just exists to give some scares. While the story isn't scary, the visuals and music are. Both Thomas and Emily are tolerable here for once, and thus I prefer it to Scaredy Engines in Season 6. This episode is fantastic. You Can't Do It, Toby is decent. While this did kickstart Toby's downward spiral for me, the scenes where he and Edward push Gordon up the hill are always enjoyable, and the music and sound effects for both scenes are really good. This episode goes below Percy's big mistake in the OK tier. James Goes Too Far is much better James episode than New Coat. Seeing James taking coal trucks and helping Diesel is some nice character development, something we don't see much in the CGI series, and his interaction with Salty is really fun. This episode goes above Thomas Saves the Day and good. Chick Is to School is a really dumb episode. Everyone in this episode is dumb and thus rides the line between poor and bad. 2 Out for Thomas is an episode I have massive nostalgia for, but despite that, this episode isn't very good. Why? Because nothing new is done here. Thomas learns his lesson again, there's a new gimmicky location, the crash, while cool, makes no sense, and the story is rather boring. This one goes into the poor tier. Percy and the Magic Carpet is our finale episode, and it's pretty okay. Percy is his usual idiot self, but I do like how the carpet isn't said to be either magic or not. And I do like how Gordon is thoroughly unimpressed about the carpet. This episode goes at the bottom of the okay tier for me. Overall, Season 8 is an interesting season. The quality of the episodes is really inconsistent. It feels like we go from a good episode to a bad episode and then another good one. And some characters like Thomas, Henry, Percy, and Toby are rather inconsistent from their previous portrayals. However, I do think this season wrote Edward, Jordan, James, and Emily really well. Emily might even be an improvement from her Season 7 persona. The new score by Robert Harshwood is a really big highlight this season. In my opinion, the score is really good and just as good as Mike and Junior's score, especially in episodes like Halloween and Thomas and the Firework Display. Overall, this season was a step down from Season 7, but it doesn't suck and thus goes in the good tier. It may be tainted by some childish plots and inconsistencies, but still has some classic quality for me. Well guys, that's about it. The Season 9 ranking video is on the horizon. I really can't wait to start work on that. Until next time, goodbye.